Welcome to Stillspeakpod. Tonight's video, I'm probably going to be doing an update on the Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito case, and then an update on the Noah and Amber Claire story. I'm going to try to combine them into one video because I don't think there's enough to talk about to make separate videos. That being said, sometimes things come to my mind. Sometimes I go on a little bit of a ramble. And if I do that, specifically with the Laundrie Petito case, then I'll separate it into two different videos. We'll see how it goes. Gabby's case blew up unlike any other case I've ever followed. It just exploded. And she became a household name. Even if people didn't know every detail of the story, they knew the basics. She was everywhere. The majority of people, if you said her name, are gonna know who she is. There was a point when she was missing where I would be scrolling my Facebook and I wouldn't even see my friend's post because it was nothing but posts about Gabby Petito. Whether that was because of groups I was in or news channels that I follow, she was all over it. And, not every case gets that attention, and that's a fact. There's certain cases where the person becomes a household name, especially if you follow true crime cases or the news. And I would say that if I said the name Casey Anthony, at least to people who live in America, you're going to know who that is. The majority. Not all, but the majority. If I say O.J. Simpson, you're going to know who that is and what he was alleged to have done. I was going to say something there, but I'll keep it to myself. If I say Lacey and Scott Peterson, you most likely know who I'm talking about. If I say JonBenet Ramsey, you most likely know who I'm talking about. And I would say that the biggest difference with Gabby's and why it seems like she blew up way more than the rest is because that we have social media. Now with Casey Anthony, that was around the time that we were all on MySpace and we were all kind of migrating over to Facebook. And so we did have some social media. But the rest, it was, a long time ago. I think JonBenet Ramsey was in 1996. Lacey Peterson and Scott Peterson's story was in the early 2000s. I believe it was 2002, Christmas. And Gabby's story was very unique. You had this young couple leaving a van to do this cross-country trip. She had a heavy social media presence. They did this trip, and then he comes back, the van comes back, but she doesn't, right? And then he lawyers up, refuses to talk, and, then takes off within 2 days of the police coming to his home. Very, very unique. And the entire story from beginning to the end was a mystery. Initially, it was, where's Gabby? Where is she, right? Where is she? How is he back? And where is she? And is she alive? And is she dead? And was it an accident? Did somebody else kill her after he left her there alive? All these theories, right? And discussions on where she could be. And of course, at the same time, it was like, why isn't he talking? And then we find out, early on that he had also left his home and not returned. And then once she was located, the story switched to, where is Brian now? Where is Brian? And then a ton of focus went on Brian Laundrie's parents. And I think part of that is because Brian wasn't around. And as soon as we found out that he wasn't around, then it was like, okay, well, they are. So I'll focus on the parents. And the theories surrounding the parents just went wild. And I would say most, if not the majority, definitely believed that they were aiding their son in some way. They knew something. They were involved. They helped him, etc., etc. I was taking a little bit of a different view on it, and I came here and I did videos on the story. I started to report on the story on the 13th, which we now know that was the day he left his home. That was only 2 days after her mother had reported her missing. The story itself actually did not explode until the 14th. Then on the 17th, when we found out that he had taken off days prior, is when the story really exploded. Because then it was like, whoa, he took off? Where the hell is he? And while everybody wanted Brian Laundrie's parents' blood, I was taking a different approach, and I was coming here in my videos that I was doing almost nightly with updates about the case and giving all these different possibilities on the parents about them possibly being involved or not being involved. And the way I was seeing it was, I imagined that Brian, did what he did to Gabby. He was coming home. He called his parents instead of just showing up without her and said something to the effect of, we broke up. She went to her parents' home. She flew there. I'm driving the van back. We're taking a break. Just a heads up that when I get there, Gabby's not going to be with me. And I said that I think there's this possibility that the entire reason that he made the ridiculous choice to come back with that van, which was just so dumb, I think that was because he knew what he was eventually going to be doing, or what he ended up doing, and he wanted to spend time with his family before doing that. It's the only thing that makes sense to me and why he brought that van back. I do not believe for a single second that he brought that van back and thought that no one was going to notice the van or that Gabby was missing. I think he knew. And I think he knew that his clock was ticking and he had to get as much time in with his family before that became noticed and her parents began to look for her. And I think that the second police arrived at his home, he knew that the clock had ran out, and at that point is when he decided to leave his home and take his life. And I was leaning that way the entire time. I really was. I explored on this channel every possibility, but I leaned that way. As time went on, though, I was starting to think, I don't know, man. This is kind of weird. I mean, it's been weeks, and they're still searching this reserve. Maybe they have evidence that he was there at some point, or is there. And I was starting to, kind of change to, okay, maybe he's still alive, I still believed that he came home to spend time with his family before taking off, but I was switching it from he went to the reserve and killed himself to he may be alive. Maybe he is. Maybe this is like all a big, plot. I don't know. I didn't know. Nobody knew where the hell this dude was. And so it's reasonable to consider all the different possibilities. And I think it was actually the day before or 2 days before his remains were found that I said that I actually was leaning towards him being alive, but I felt that he was close to home because I couldn't reconcile him getting away somewhere due to the amount of surveillance cameras that are everywhere, including Ubers and buses and trains, etc. But then the reserve got opened, and that evening, his parents called their lawyer and told them that they wanted to search the reserve for Brian. And then he called and gave law enforcement a heads up that they were going to be going out there in the morning to do that. They sent officers out there to meet the parents. There was 2 of them. I believe one was an FBI agent and one was a Northport police officer. And they began to search in the areas that the parents had told law enforcement they believe he would be. And they told them that at the very start of the story. They said these are the particular places that he would normally frequent when he went there. And so when they went there, they went to those specific areas. And not long after arriving there, the father, Christopher Laundrie, located a wet bag that belonged to Brian. And then an officer found his backpack and skeletal remains. This was a massive development. And they were located together, so immediately it was, oh my God, it's him. He's dead. Later that day, the FBI came out and they told us that they found items that do belong to Brian Laundrie. Later on after that, it was circulating that what they had found was a partial skull. The next day or the day after that, it came out that they had done dental records and matched it to the skull and confirmed it to be Brian Laundrie. And this is, rather unusual because they usually do DNA, first. But I guess at the time they were still looking in the reserve for other parts of him. And so they were just going off the skull, I guess, until they can find more of him. When we found out that they did it through the dental records, I think it was safe to assume that what they had originally found was the bottom part of your mouth. I think it's the mandible. The bottom part, I matched the dental records to that. Because oftentimes that's the part that will fall off of the skull after death. It kind of separates, especially if you had some type of wound to the head. Well, these dental records weren't enough for people. They did not believe he was dead. They refused to accept it. And because it was the parents going out to the reserve, which sparked them finally finding Brian, it was crazy land speculation of basically they planted these items, which I thought was so ridiculous to think, considering they were with officers. They also were being followed by Fox News, who was with them. So they would have been planting items with the media and the police officer and FBI agent. But beyond that, that would also mean they scattered their dead son's remains through the reserve. I mean, come on. Just come on. And then at that point, I kind of was like, all right, I'm going to wrap this story up. I think I did 2 more videos after that because we found out that Northport police had been doing surveillance on the home from the very beginning with video cameras, and I did a whole video about that. And I also did a video about, Northport claiming that they had mistaken Roberta, Brian's mother, for Brian. There's a whole video on that as well. And then I kind of, in my mind, was like, the story's over, folks. That's it, right? You had 2 people, they left in a van, 1 came back with the van. We find out that the person who was left behind is dead. Then he goes missing. 5 weeks goes by. We find his remains. They confirm it's him. Dude's dead. Not only is he dead, but he's in many pieces. And that's it. And I said to myself, in my mind, okay, that's it. We're just going to move on now because there's nothing to really discuss at this point. And I felt that it made the most sense. The conclusion made the most sense. And it was the simplest and easiest answer. And I said in one of my videos, when the case was at its height, when both Gabby and Brian were not located at this point. I think it was the 18th or the 19th, the day that she was actually found, but earlier that day. Facebook and YouTube was blowing up. And I was out all day that day. And when I came home to try to catch up on the developments of the day, it was just so chaotic out there. People and the theories, whoo, it was wild. And I came on, I made a very brief, 7-minute video, and I said, the simplest and easiest answer is usually the right answer. Take a deep breath. You're going into, crazy conspiracy land. And I believe that. I do believe that the simplest answer is usually the right one. Not every story is complex. Now, the Murdaugh story, that's very complex. Lori Vallow, very complex. But most stories are not. They're usually very simple, very cut and dry, and it made the most sense to me. He didn't want to go to jail, or he felt some type of guilt, and he wanted out. And he took his life. End of story. I knew, due to following other cases, that eventually we were going to get more information. We were going to most likely get some of the discoveries that the law enforcement had put together. But I kind of was like, well, it's probably going to be a few months. So I moved on, okay? And while I was carrying videos on this channel of the Petito case, at the same time, I was also covering other cases, and I felt that those cases also deserved some airtime. So I just went back to doing videos about other cases and just said, well, if we get more information, then we'll discuss it more. But in my mind, it was a done deal. It wasn't a done deal, though, to a lot of people. A lot of people still, especially on Twitter, were very set that this was not Brian Laundrie's remains, that the parents planted his remains or were still involved in some way. And they were still screaming from the rooftops that the Laundries aided Brian in some way and they need to be charged. And they were, still going on about justice for Gabby. On Facebook, though, every group that I was in came almost to a complete screeching halt. It just went from non-stop, post after post after post after post to nothing. Literally, I don't even see it on my timeline anymore. And this is a story that used to take up my entire timeline. So I think a lot of people just kind of was like, all right, well, that's it, right? They're both dead. What else is there really to discuss here? There really isn't much. Well, then yesterday, early in the day, it was said by Stephen Bertolino, the Laundrie family lawyer, who we talked about a lot on this channel, said that the autopsy results may be coming in later in the day or the following day. Now, he was just remains, right? Mostly skeletal remains. At least that's what we've been told by the FBI. But they have not been very forthcoming with information, which is not abnormal. And we do not know what they found after they gave their press conference saying that they found items belonging to Brian. They spent a few days after that in the reserve looking for other things and more of him, but they never came back and said, oh, we also found this and we also found that. So it was kind of up in the air on what they actually found. So he goes to a medical examiner, but they couldn't come up with manner or cause of death. They sent him off to an anthropologist, and so that's what we were waiting on. So midday yesterday, it was said by Stephen Bertolino that the manner of death was suicide and the cause was a gunshot wound to the head. This was not even slightly shocking at all, because this is what I already had assumed. And We don't know when he died or anything of that nature. I would assume that he killed himself rather quickly once he got to the reserve. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Brian Laundrie was dead before the story even exploded on the 14th, which is really wild to think about in hindsight, that at the point that we were all talking about, where's Gabby? Why isn't he talking? And all the protesters were outside of his house screaming, come out, you coward. Tell us where she is. He was already dead. So he never even saw how big this story blew up, most likely. He had no idea, most likely, that protesters were outside his home, and that, Fox News and CNN and News Nation, and keep listing all of them, were covering this story. He most likely had no idea that people, were camping outside his home, basically, and living underneath pop-up tents in his neighbors' yards. So I don't think the pressure is what caused him to make this decision to kill himself, if he indeed killed himself the day he went out there, which I think just makes the most sense. I mean, why would he go out to this reserve and live out there for a week and then kill himself? That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So if that's the case, then it wasn't the public pressure. It wasn't the media pressure. He didn't see any of that. This was solely knowing what he had done, solely knowing that they were wondering what he knew, solely knowing that the police knew that her van was at his house, okay? Now, with this new information, the biggest question that everybody had yesterday, and it was kind of driving me nuts, was they were going, where's the gun then? Where's the gun then? They didn't say they found a gun. They said they found a notebook and a backpack. It's the FBI, folks. They don't usually tell us information unless it's to show us a conclusion or a major development. At the time they spoke to us about finding his backpack and notebook, at that point, along with the skeletal remains, is what they said, partial skeletal remains, that might have been all they had found at that point. But they continued to stay in that reserve that day and then a couple of days after that. I'm not quite sure. I don't remember now. I'd have to go look. But I want to say it was about 4 or 5 days that they stood out there, okay? And so they could have found a gun. They could have. And we just don't know that they found it. It does not mean that the parents went there, found the gun, disposed of the gun elsewhere. It does not mean that the gun is still out there. It just means at this point, we don't know if they found a gun. Now, when a medical examiner, is doing an autopsy, they take into consideration the crime scene and what was found there, what the circumstances were, etc. And with Brian, he was, in pretty bad shape, right? He was in pieces. And even if they had found that gun and he was in pieces, they need more to rule it a suicide and a gunshot wound to the head. They can't be like, oh, well, you found these skeletal remains scattered everywhere and a gun, so, I guess it was a gunshot wound. They can't make a guess just because a gun was found near him. And they also have to consider that even if they found a gun somewhat near him, that it could be somebody else's gun and not specifically Brian's gun. So they can't just go around guessing just because a gun was at the scene and be like, oh, well, we don't know, but there was a gun there, so I guess it was that. It just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. Now, think about this. So he kills himself. Now, let's say it was the day that he left his home. It wasn't until October 21st when they found these remains. So it was 5 weeks. So he kills himself that day. His body drops to the floor, right? And when you shoot yourself in the head, your hand, the gun, your hand goes out. So if you're right-handed, it's going to go out to the right, and it's going to be somewhat near your body. If you're left-handed, of course, it's the opposite. And so he would have fell right where he had been standing or sitting or whatever he did before he did it. But then it's very clear, even without seeing the full autopsy report, that at some point, he not only was underwater, okay, because that's the whole thing, is that this particular area he was found in, at the time that they searched, or they tried to search that specific area, it was underwater. And because this is like a swamp, and it's a reserve, and it's Florida. So not only was he underwater for a period of time, but there are alligators in there, and vultures, and God knows what else. Florida has bobcats and things of that nature too, and it seems like at some point during the decomposition process, he was, and it's really gross, but he was eaten. So there was a whole mixture of elements here that caused his body to be in that way. And if you think about it, if a vulture is, this is so gross. It really is gross. Because I hate vultures. They're disgusting. There's a zoo that we go to, and there's a lot of, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful zoo, don't get me wrong. But there's a lot of vultures that like to hang around the animal cages, and they're just gross. And when you ever see them like eating a dead animal on the side of the road, it's just nasty. Like they're pulling and gross. And so you can imagine almost the same thing, right? And other animals and bugs, and then the water, and then the water is going to move certain body parts. And so at some point, he could have kind of, floated down a little bit, and then animals kind of moved him around. And so anyway, point being, Brian Laundrie was scattered all over the place. So you wouldn't necessarily find the gun right next to him, right? Because of that. Because he can move, the gun is not going to go anywhere. And if they find the gun, or they found it already, it's most likely going to be close to the original area where he killed himself. Now, due to the water, they're not going to find, at least I don't think so, let's just say blood on a tree stump or a branch or a specific spot, because this entire area was underwater. But it would be very safe to assume that his body originally fell somewhat close to that gun, because the gun's not going to go flying across the reserve. So then Stephen Bertolino, the family's lawyer, said that when they had reported Brian missing, the family had turned over all their guns, and there was one missing. And that Brian Laundrie owned a pistol. Now, this is really important, because Northport Police was asked multiple times about, did Brian have a gun when he left his home? And they refused to answer it. And they also wouldn't answer if they felt that he might have killed himself. Okay? They said they didn't want to, speculate on that, and they would leave it to us to do that, etc. Now, what I'm actually interested in, when did the family realize there was a gun missing? Did they realize that immediately after he left the home upset? Or was it when they started to turn the guns over to law enforcement that they realized, oh my God, there's a gun missing? So I think for the parents, they most likely knew in their gut, just being a parent at that point, at the point whenever it was that they realized that a gun was missing and that he didn't come home, they most likely knew that he ended his life. And I don't think that they knew that prior. And I've seen several people say that, and actually this is running longer than I thought, so I'm probably going to separate them into two videos. But I've seen some people say things like, oh, they knew. He told them that he was going to go kill himself. No, come on, guys. No parent is going to just be like, oh, okay, son, and not try to stop him from doing that. Come on. It is their son, their only son, their last child, their baby of the family. Okay, there's an age gap between him and his sister. He lived with them. They're not going to willingly just go along with him going and killing himself and not do anything to stop him. That's just ridiculous. And I just have to assume that anybody who would say that is most likely not a parent. Because, I mean, just please. And even with knowing that he left and most likely had this gun with him, sometimes people don't want to, accept the reality. And until you have confirmation, you're not going to immediately assume that that's what happened, although I'm sure it was in the back of their minds for the 5 weeks that the law enforcement agencies were scouring this reserve. What sticks out to me even more than that is that law enforcement knew that a gun had been missing from the family home, and yet they still stayed in that reserve for weeks all over that reserve looking for him. And that's fine because he was reported as missing and they can't treat it differently just because he was a person of interest. And so, they had to find him one way or another. At the same time, he had a warrant out for using Gabby's credit card, so he also was wanted. So that played into it too. But I think it was like the second week in October, Brian Enton, one of the reporters who was on this case and outside the family home, did an interview with Josh Taylor, the media spokesperson for Northport Police. And he basically asked him, do you think he's dead or alive? And his answer was basically we have no freaking idea. And even then, he didn't mention that there's a possibility he is dead in the reserve because a gun was missing. So, Northport, I've had a lot to say about Northport. You can see my other videos. I'm not even going to go there tonight because, yeah. And while most people think that there's been some massive cover-up or that there were other people who helped Brian in some way, aka the parents, or that there was some big complex conspiracy here, I don't believe that. I don't. And the only thing that I think about this story is that there was a lot of police blunders. And not just from Northport Police, but also from the Moab, Utah police that were involved in the incident involving Gabby and Brian on August 12th. I think that the case blew up so much and it was unlike anything they had handled before. And a lot of rather big, careless mistakes were made. And Northport has definitely tried to deflect blame. But in my opinion, no. They're at fault for some of this. But again, you can listen to my other videos about that. I'm not going to repeat all of it. So I hopped onto somebody else's channel just to kind of see what everybody was talking about, to kind of get a feel for the environment with this new information, because the groups, while the information was shared in those groups, they weren't active really. Nobody really seemed to want to talk about it. So I did that and I hopped onto a YouTube channel and I was just kind of annoying myself because listening to what was being said and then also reading the chat, I just cannot understand why people cannot accept the conclusion to this story. I don't personally understand. From the start to the finish of this story, the theories are unlike anything I've ever seen. Some of these theories that unfolded during this story were just Looney Town. I don't even know how else to describe it. Just really, really out there type of theories. And while that does happen in a lot of cases, this one was a whole other level. In addition to this being such a blown up case on a whole other level, the theories were also on another level. And they still are. They still are. The comments on this video that I watched was just, what are you people even talking about? And then I thought about it, and I knew the answer. I've said the answer before on this channel on why people will continue to have theories even though we have answers to a story. And that is because that would be admitting they were wrong. And for most people, admitting you're wrong is a really hard thing to do. And so they had painted such a theory and story in their minds, and it didn't turn out that way. And I really think they started to believe 100% that their theory was what actually happened and was factual, and admitting that it wasn't and that you were wrong is really hard for people to do. In addition, I think because there's a lot of new people to the story as far as following true crime. In every story, you get a different group of people who have never followed a true crime story before, and so they don't know how they usually unfold and how things are handled. For example, they don't know that the FBI is always quiet and they always keep things to themselves. So that's new to them. They have no idea that that's how it usually is in a case. And so the fact that the FBI was so quiet in this story, it left a lot of questions unanswered, which made everybody's minds wander. So I saw somebody say, this whole story has been suspicious. And I'm like, no, it really wasn't suspicious. There was actually nothing suspicious about the story. The public made the story suspicious. The person talking on the video was like, this story has been so sketchy. Everything about it was totally abnormal. That's not true. And it was actually really disappointing to hear that person say that, because this person is actually pretty well known in the true crime community and has followed many cases and would know that it was actually very normal, except for the few police blunders. But this is not the first case where there was police blunders. That has happened in other cases as well. So no, it was actually rather normal. Once the FBI takes over, everything kind of goes silent and we get very little information until the conclusion of the story. It does not mean that, the FBI is lying and told the parents that their son was dead and he's really not. Because that's actually some of the theories. Yes, there are people in the comments who believe even now that they did DNA in addition to the dental records and a full autopsy and anthropologist, that he's still alive. And this is all a big lie. And that the parents are still aiding him and he's out there somewhere. Not kidding. The FBI does not operate that way, okay? They're not going to come out and say, we have DNA that says it's Brian Laundrie, if that's not true. That's not how they operate. And some of the people believe that, and they believe they did that so that the media would go away. Listen, the FBI doesn't care about the freaking media. Yeah, they get phone calls. Yeah, they get emails. They just ignore it. They don't care. They're used to it. So the story being so blown up and in the media every night would not cause the Federal Bureau of Investigation to come out and say they found the remains of a person of interest in a homicide, and they matched his dental records and DNA, and it's him, if that's not the case. Brian Laundrie is dead. D-E-A-D. Not only is he dead, but he's in many, many pieces. Okay? He's long gone. And I know that's hard for some people to accept. I know that some people really were dead set on a specific conclusion. I get it. Trust me, I do. I've been there before, many years ago, with cases when I didn't know back then how they usually go. If you really sit and think about it, the conclusion makes the most sense. So then, Gabby Petito's parents, the Petitos and the Schmidts, put out a statement through their lawyer, Richard Stafford. And this statement sparked complete excitement in people, I would say, because they thought that this was implying something. I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to make my statement about it. So, quote, "The Schmidt and Petito family have been aware of the circumstances surrounding the suicide of the sole suspect in Gabby's murder. Gabby's family will not be making a statement at this time due to the request of the United States Attorney's Office and the Teton County Prosecutor's Office. The family was asked not to make any comments and let the FBI continue their investigation. The family was also asked to wait for the United States Attorney's Office to make a determination on whether any additional individuals will be charged. When that determination is made, we will have a statement," unquote. People read this and they immediately were like, oh my God, they're considering charging somebody else. And oh my God, the parents, they're probably investigating the parents and seeing if they can charge the parents. Oh my God, oh my God. Even the media, who should know better, had headlines of, family lawyer hints at possible charges. The FBI does a full investigation, and it's a part of their procedures and protocol to make sure that nobody else was involved in a crime with a criminal or suspect or suspects. That is normal. This case is still active. It has not come to the full conclusion yet because they're still dotting their I's and crossing their T's and getting their ducks in a row before they finalize and close it out now that they are both deceased. During that process, with their procedures and protocols, they are going to check to make sure that nobody, yes, including the parents, his sister, any friends, anybody, helped him in any way with this crime or his own leaving of the house that day in September. In addition, in this statement, it says sole suspect in the murder of Gabby Petito. That statement is factually incorrect. Brian has never been named a suspect in her homicide/murder, because he was a person of interest. He was the sole person of interest. And police, during the entire 5 weeks that they were searching for Brian Laundrie in the reserve, never upgraded him to suspect. The day that Brian's remains were found in the reserve and they held a press conference, they did finally, refer to her homicide as a murder. Prior to that, they were referring to it as a homicide only. So that was the first time we actually heard them say the word murder. However, they did not call him a suspect even then. They referred to him as a person of interest. Now, in her parents' mind, he's a suspect, right? In the majority of our minds, we think he's a suspect, but he has never officially been named a suspect. And that's important in the context of this statement, because let me read it again. The Schmidt and Petito family has been aware of the circumstances surrounding the suicide of the sole suspect in Gabby's murder. Gabby's family will not be making a statement at this time. Now, this is the key part. Due to the request of the United States Attorney's Office and the Teton County Prosecutor's Office. And then later in the statement it says, and let the FBI continue their investigation. So why is that key in the context of Brian only being a person of interest? Well, Gabby Petito was found on September 19th. Her cause of death came back on the 21st. Her manner of death. Okay? We later got the cause of death, which was manual strangulation, and it was homicide. From that point, when it was said that it was a homicide, to the point that they found Brian's remains in the Carlton Reserve, or the state park that's attached to the reserve. The name is too hard to say. I'm not even saying it. That was about a month and 2 days. And during that month and 2 days, they never named him a suspect, and they never came out and said that we have proof that he killed Gabby Petito and that they released a warrant for his arrest for the murder of Gabby. That's key. And that's key because during their investigation and when they do their procedures and protocols to close out the investigation, they need to make sure that Brian was who killed Gabby. As of right now, it's never been said that Brian Laundrie killed Gabby Petito. That's a fact. It's never been said. We have no idea what evidence they have or if they can tie him to her death. We don't. We have no information about that. So during their investigation, they have to make sure that nobody else killed her. And it was Brian. So it makes a ton of sense that her parents would not make a statement about his death, because if they come out and they make a statement saying Brian Laundrie who killed our daughter, and it ends up being that Brian didn't kill her, well, oops. It's kind of embarrassing, right? I mean, I would say so. And that statement says the United States Attorney's Office and Teton County Prosecutor's Office. Teton County Prosecutor's Office would have nothing to do with prosecuting Brian Laundrie's parents. That's in Wyoming, where Gabby was found. So this tells me this actually has more to do with confirming that it was Brian who killed her than it is that anybody is actually going to be charged. But it's the entire process. This is not abnormal. This means absolutely nothing. This does not mean that somebody is going to be arrested or that the parents specifically will be arrested or that they had any involvement at all. The FBI is just doing their job because this was a very high profile case and they want to make sure that they did a thorough investigation and the proper person is held accountable if they can be held accountable. Meaning, if it's Brian, well, he's dead. You can't take a dead person to court, right? He's dead. So the case will be closed at that point. But if it wasn't Brian, which I highly doubt, but you can't just assume that when you're working for the FBI, you have to make sure of that, then they would have to prosecute the appropriate person who killed Gabby Petito. And I know most of you guys are like, oh, give me a break. He killed her. I know. I agree with you. I said from day one that I believe that he killed her. And I explored all the other possibilities. But at the end of the day, I kept coming back to he killed her. I mean, it's rather clear, right? For us. But we're not the FBI. And again, you can't just go around guessing. It's not the way it works. To me, the story's over. And I think it's tragic. And I know that people are like, oh, screw him. I get it. Trust me. right? I get it. At the same time, I just think the overall story is just so beyond tragic. You have two very young individuals who at one point were engaged to be married. And they set out on a trip that so many of us would love to be able to do. And something so horrific happens. And then the other comes back and ends up taking his life. And for what? What caused this to happen? What signs were missed? What argument could have been so bad between these two individuals in this beautiful setting and background that caused him to strangle this young, beautiful, full of life girl to death and then have to also take his own life? What was so horrific? I just don't understand how it could have elevated to this level. I mean, I know how it does. What I'm saying is, without the story, which the only two people who knew this would have been Brian and Gabby, right? And they're both gone, is what happened right before that. And the only way we will ever know that is if his notebook, God, I can't talk tonight, excuse me, notebook that they found somehow is able to be salvaged, and there is some type of suicide note in there that possibly includes a confession of sorts or some type of detail of what happened right before he ended up killing Gabby. If they don't have that, okay, then we're never going to know, because the only person alive who knew that information is dead. I just want to know. I would love to know what the hell was so awful that it led you to strangle this young girl. This girl that you at some point had to have loved. I can't assume that you didn't, but possibly you didn't. But how did this trip go so wrong? What was it? And how can it be prevented in the future? Because that's the biggest thing for me. I don't follow true crime cases just because I'm interested in them. I'm always looking for what can we learn from this story that can prevent it from happening again in our own lives or in other people's lives. Gabby's family started almost immediately the Gabby Petito Foundation, which is wonderful. And they're going to be doing all types of stuff. It seems that they're still trying to get their ducks in a row on what they specifically want to work on. But I think it's amazing. It's a wonderful way to channel their grief, to keep her alive and remember her. And the parents talked about the Amber Alert and their concerns that there isn't one for adults between the ages of 18 and 65, because you have Silver Alert for elderly, you have Amber Alert for under 18, and there's a few other ones depending on what state you live in America. And their hope is that they will try to work towards getting one for adults. And that's great, but people have tried that before, and it never seems to work out. And there's usually guidelines, like the Amber Alert has to meet certain criteria in order for it to be, triggered or enacted. And an Amber Alert would have never even worked for Gabby, because we knew where her van was, so you couldn't track her down with the van. It was that you didn't know where she was. And the thing with Amber Alert specifically is you usually have a vehicle description, license plate, suspect, or the person had been taken or was in extreme danger. It varies from state to state. They each have their own guidelines. They're all relatively the same, but it does vary a little bit. So even if Amber Alert specifically went all the way to 65 years old, that would have never helped Gabby. So I would think that if you're going to do something like that, and for adults, you would have to work out some criteria where it wouldn't be involving a vehicle in order for it to work. But in Gabby's story, it was everywhere in 48 hours. If only every story blew up that much. But the problem is that so many people go missing. If every story blew up like that, that's all you would ever see on the news. Seriously, there's so many that go missing a day. Thankfully, the majority are found safe. But if you send out an alert for every single one of them, oh my goodness. But going back to what we can learn from this case, her foundation, if they're going to be focusing on some type of domestic violence, domestic abuse, that's amazing. Gabby can't be saved, right? She is deceased. It's so freaking tragic. She was only 22 years old. Very motivated, ambitious girl. Seemed very sweet, although we didn't know her, right? But from her story, if we can raise more awareness, that's amazing. And hopefully it will help other people from having the same fate. And I'm really happy that they decided to do this. A lot of people have been giving them grief because they don't really know what they're going to use the foundation to do. And all I'm going to say to that is give them time, okay? First, they're still grieving, for Pete's sake. It's been only 2 months since her body was located, and it's only been 3 months since they last spoke to her, ever. And so while they're grieving, they're trying to put together this foundation, and there's a lot that they're going to have to learn that they didn't know about before. So be patient. They'll get it together, and I highly suggest that if you want to help domestic violence victims, to consider donating to the Gabby Petito Foundation. What sense is there in talking about this case for now, God, I don't know how many hours on end on this particular channel, in addition to many other channels and groups, if we're not going to in some way learn from it or use it as a way to save somebody else? It'd be kind of pointless. There's no sense in even discussing it then. At least in my opinion, that's how I feel. So to wrap this up, because I wanted it to be an update on 2 different stories, but that didn't happen because I am who I am and I rambled, blah. So I'm going to wrap this up and then do an update on the Claire story, and then also bring you a video on 2 missing people who went missing recently from Orlando, Florida, in 2 separate situations. So basically, in a nutshell for me here is I want the information from FBI. I want the discoveries from Northport Police. I want some of my questions answered because I invested a lot of time into covering this story, and I really am interested in the ultimate results. And so we're going to continue following it. But in my mind, the story is over. Brian's dead. It was simple. It's not complex. He's not in Mexico. He's not in Canada. He's not living in the Appalachian Trail with a beard down to his knees. The FBI is not trying to cover up the parents' crimes. The FBI did not lie about whether or not he was dead or alive. Dead, excuse me. Brian Laundrie is dead. Period. The story's over. Okay? And there's many, many, many other stories who need our attention. So, when more details come out that are significant, not just little tiny pieces of information, I will do another video on Gabby Petito, just so we can bring it to a full conclusion and get some of our questions answered. Other than that, that's it, folks. 2 young individuals are now dead. And I think once we do get some discovery information, I think a lot of things will make sense. I think we'll see things that will make us go, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Oh, yeah, I remember that. So I think that's going to be what happens. So I'm putting Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie on the shelf for now. I should say back on the shelf because it's been a good month since I even went here with this story. And don't get me wrong, I can talk about this story with somebody for hours. I mean, we can talk about all the different things. And I think it's a very interesting story. It's, without a shadow of a doubt, unique, for sure. And not unique that one person dies and the other one kills himself, but unique in the sense of this cross-country trip and how it unfolded. But I think we need to recognize that it's unique without automatically jumping to the entire story sketchy and there's something shady going on. I think it's just the story was unique and everything else about it was rather normal in the sense of how an investigation unfolds. But hey, to each their own. If you want to continue to believe that Brian Laundrie's alive and he's out there, by all means, go for it. So now I'm out and moving on. Until next time, I'll see you soon.